Thank you to everyone who is joining us for today's plenary event, for which we have the great pleasure to introduce Rector Federica Mogherini. My name is Theofanis Exadaktylos, and I am the co-editor of the JCMS Annual Review, which sponsors this lecture. And the text of the lecture will be published in the forthcoming issue of the JCMS Annual Review later this month. Before I pass on to my good colleague Roberta Guerrina, who is the other co-editor of the JCMS Annual Review, and subsequently to Rector Mogherini, I would like to say a few words about the majority of you are familiar with the Annual Review, which is a key component of the Journal of Common Market Studies. And as such, we share the overall aim of publishing high quality, innovative, but yet accessible articles that advance debates in European and comparative regionalism studies. So the specific role of the Annual Review is to provide a rigorous analysis of the most important events and political trends that emerge year by year in the context of the European Union, including, of course, the annual lecture, which is delivered by a leading scholar or a leading practitioner in the field. Within the annual review, we aim to cover key developments in the European Union, its member states, and regions of the world linked to European politics in any sort of form that happened in the previous year, including important developments in the domestic or external arena that shape the political debates in Europe. Therefore, the annual review becomes the most up-to-date and authoritative source of information for practitioners, scholars, students, and of course, researchers of European integration, but also accessible to general readers who simply want to know more about the European Union and see a variety and a pluralism of voices from leading scholars and practitioners. So in line with the ethos and the inspiring principles of the Journal of Common Market Studies, the annual review is a multidisciplinary outlet. We are open to all methodological and theoretical approaches. And let me add at this stage that we are actively promoting a balanced set of contributors, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of career stage and location where our contributors are based. This year, reflecting on 2020, we focused, of course, on the global public health crisis of coronavirus. Particularly exploring the institutional dimension of the European Union, the policy responses that were developed in specific countries and within the European Union itself, and the impact that the pandemic has had on European politics, policies, and of course, our European societies. We also reflect on climate change and environmental politics as a common and shared problem within European countries, and the decisions that have been taking place in the context of Brussels. We have also included contributions exploring the relations of the EU with the United States. We had a change of guard, of course, in the US and with China, but also the latest on Brexit developments, because we have been running a series on those for the last few years. We also look at the Eastern Mediterranean, Belarus, and also the Caucasus region in terms of the regional conflicts and the political developments there. Finally, we take stock of social elements in terms of socioeconomic cohesion, issues of immigration, and of course the manifestation of social movements such as Black Lives Matter in Europe, with a view to map out the challenges for Europe and beyond. So at this stage, I would like to invite Professor Roberta Guerrina, my co-editor on the JCMS Annual Review, to introduce the annual lecture and our guest speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Theofanis. And it's a really great pleasure for us to be here today to share the annual lecture with the UASIS community. So this year's annual lecture, as Theofanis pointed out, reflects on the year 2020, when we have seen yet another crisis. So what we tasked our keynote speaker today was to examine if this crisis is different in scope and depth, and what does it mean for the European Union, for the future of the Union itself. So this year's speaker for the annual review lecture does not need any introduction. Federica Mogherini is currently the Rector of the College of Europe and co-chair of the United Nations High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement since 2020. But I think what most of you know her for is her previous role as the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, a position that she held from 2014 to 2019. Previously, she held office in the Italian as the Italian Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, as well as member of the Italian Chamber of Deputies. So what we asked her to consider this year is to give us some insights about the impact of 2020 on the future of the Union and the project of European integration. As editors, we felt that it was important for us to understand the challenge of 2020 from the perspective of the institutions. So it is now my pleasure to hear from Rector Mogherini about how the EU will deal with the latest crisis. Over to you, Rector Mogherini.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to join you, an honor from Bruges, from the College of Europe, and to share some thoughts that, as you mentioned, will also be published in a few weeks on how 2020 has shaped the future of the European Union when, in my eyes, a crisis turns into an opportunity. And let me say that obviously my viewpoint and the thoughts I'll be sharing with you today are based not so much on an academic perspective, but on my individual reading of what has happened in 2020 and the way in which the European institutions and member states have reacted to the situation in that year, from the point of view of my experience within the institutions, being them national institutions or European ones or global ones. And to look at that, I actually start looking a little bit before 2020. So allow me to take first steps back. The entire first decades of the new millennium have been a solid reminder of how wise and correct Jean Monnet was by predicting that, if you allow me some French, l'Europe se fera dans les crises et elle sera la somme des solutions apportées à ces crises. To analyze how the year 2020 has impacted the future of the European Union, I think we need to take a step back and read carefully how Europe got to the end of the second decade of the century and how the multiple crises that have shaken our continent before that year have contributed to shaping the Union's reaction to the pandemic and its connected and related effects. The years 2000 have started with a major economic and financial crisis and their heavy social repercussions, terrorist attacks on European soil, conflicts in the east of our continent and all across the Mediterranean, massive flows of refugees and migrants desperately searching for a place to live safely, a shrinking space for democracy, human rights and rule of law that has affected also our continent as part of a more global trend, the loss for the first time ever of one member state with the UK decision to leave the Union, devastating climate disruption, and last but not least, an unprecedented global pandemic. So this quite dramatic picture allows us to fully capture at a glance the magnitude of the challenges that our continent has faced in the most recent years. The sequence and combination of these challenges could have produced an existential threat to the very same pursuit of the European integration project. In fact, only 5 years ago, during the summer of 2016, many commentators and analysts were arguing that the Brexit referendum would have opened the door to the beginning of the end for the European Union. Many were predicting that our union would have soon collapsed, as they believed many more member states would have followed the UK path. As we discuss today the future of Europe, just 5 years ago, we were discussing how to avoiding the European Union not having a future at all. Instead, what has actually happened as the Brexit negotiations started to develop, among numerous difficulties, is that all those political movements and leaders that were founding their political discourse and their very identity on the anti-European and anti-system narrative realized at once that criticizing the European Union was probably much less complicated and much more convenient, both politically but also economically, if done while keeping the respective countries solidly within the bloc, rather than facing the unexplored, risky, and bumpy road of negotiations to exit. So the actual start of the Brexit process acted as an extremely effective wake-up call to reality. Staying in the European Union is very convenient, even when you don't like all aspects of it. So the prediction of a long list of countries deciding to exit the Union proved to be based on wrong assumptions. When what actually happened was rather the opposite, with a strong determination from the remaining 27 member states to relaunch and strengthen both the symbols, the narrative, the politics, and the policies of the European integration process. The boldest message of unity and the clearest sign that the 27 understood the risk and were determined to react together came, in my opinion, in March 2017, during the celebrations for the anniversary of the Treaty of Rome. And I perfectly remember the sense of belonging, pride, and hope that those days brought to the European landscape, not only across institutions, but also in public opinions all over the continent. Not only it was not going to be the beginning of the end, it was set to become the beginning of relaunched European unity. A unity that, in fact, the 27 managed to keep all along the difficult negotiations that have then led to the effective exit of the UK from the EU, something not many were ready to bet on in those early months. The turning point of the collective unified reaction to the Brexit referendum has constituted a solid element of hope, of self-confidence, of trust, and even a sense of relief. Still, the multiplicity of crises was exposing our societies and our institutions to a perfect storm, in which the point of no return seemed to be inevitably getting closer by the day. The European Union was perceived, and most importantly, perceived itself as on the edge of collapse. The European integration, which had so far been the most successful political integration experiment in history, seemed destined to turn soon and irremediably into a disintegration process. And I personally remember very vividly the sense of frustration within the European institutions during those years. Every single day seemed to bring a new crisis or a new ramification and development of a pre-existing one. Many good things were done, and yet every step taken in the direction of solutions seemed to be shadowed and partially even deactivated by the challenge of the day. And while the rest of the world often looked at the European Union as a beacon of hope in an increasingly conflictual and fragmented global order, the political discourse, media narrative, and public opinions inside Europe were reflecting the image of a continent in an existential identity crisis. The Union was probably performing better than perceived, and this was much more evident at the eyes of our external partners across the world than at those of our citizens and even sometimes of our own leaders. But all those that were predicting the collapse of the European Union were clearly wrong, and Jean Monnet was clearly right. All those crises, including the one of self-confidence and self-perception, have provided to our union the opportunity to test its limits, identify shortcomings and gaps, open a critical public reflection on changes that might be needed, shape new instruments and new policies, relaunch some elements of internal understanding and solidarity within and among institutions and across societies. And I would say most importantly, prove its relevance on issues of literally vital importance for communities and individuals across the entire continent and probably far beyond our borders. Years ago, for instance, when I started my mandate in Brussels, one of the main arguments used to attack and try to dismantle the European integration process was the irrelevance of the institutions and of their actions for the ordinary citizens' lives. Over time, and as crises accumulated and multiplied dramatically, the narrative of the anti-European political discourse has shifted from the irrelevance of the EU institutions to their shortcomings, to the failure to deliver on competences that actually are not theirs, and expectations that have been put on the European level as actually the national ones were finding it more and more difficult, if not impossible, to deliver themselves on the needs of their own citizens. Today, at almost any stage of any crisis, at any turn of the bumpy roads of our times, the instinctive temptation of public opinions and national institutions across the continent is to turn towards Brussels and ask for solutions, even when actually the treaties don't give any institutional competence or responsibility to the European institutions on those specific policies that are instead exclusive domain for national authorities to exercise their sovereign decision-making responsibilities. Now, this unexpected and extraordinary rise of expectations was simply unimaginable a few years ago, before the tornado of crisis that has hit Europe, and not only Europe, in some cases the entire globe, had put an extra burden over the shoulders of any institution that is expected to deliver for its citizens. In this new perceived, or rather projected, level of ambition, this demand for European policies and solutions, is this a stepping stone on which further elements of the integration process can be built? Or is it a political trap, a self-fulfilling prophecy that over time will only fuel frustrations and serve the anti-European discourse? Expecting solutions and actions that do not match with powers and competences can be an extraordinarily powerful push for change, increasing and deepening instruments, resources, and tools. But it can also lead to inevitable short-term failures, providing an easy scapegoat for all those that do not manage to identify effective responses to difficult challenges, being at a national or local level, and turn upwards to discharge responsibilities they cannot carry or deliver upon. I believe 2020 has marked a turning point in this process, shaping the future of our union much more than it could have been expected or predicted. The year had started with high expectations on the new institutional cycle. After a short delay in the appointment and confirmation of commissioners by the European Parliament in the late months of 2019, and in the midst of complex and controversial Brexit arrangements and negotiations, a brand new commission was finally in place, led for the very first time by a woman with a clear and very ambitious political agenda centered on the digital transformation of our societies and economies, and a Green Deal set to serve both the European and the global interests in the key domain of climate change and sustainability. The European Council, the Parliament, and the Commission seemed to a large extent aligned and ready to back solid, consistent, and coordinated actions to give substance to these priorities indicated by the institutions, but also largely shared by the European public opinions. And then the pandemic came. At first, COVID hit disproportionately some countries more than others, fueling the non-unusual gap in perceptions of gravity and urgency on different issues. We often point at divisions in policies and politics across Europe and well beyond political families and affiliations, without always realizing that in most cases, priorities and decisions are defined not so much by ideological or theoretical approaches, but rather by the diverging degree of perceived gravity that the same issue can project in different societies and public opinions. The European Union has experienced this gap of perceived urgency several times during its most recent history. Geography, economy, culture, and history itself constantly contribute to fueling this diversity of perception. It is a challenge, but also an incredible opportunity to listen and understand concerns, analysis, and proposals well beyond one's local or national background and environment. The fundamental added value of having all EU nationalities represented in all institutions is precisely the fact that this helps to shape approaches, proposals, and responses that factor in from the very first stages a plurality of viewpoints and perceptions, which should help in turn to deliver outputs that correspond and match better with the expectations of citizens across the continent. Commissioners themselves, while not representing their country, with the explicit reference in the swearing-in formula to the impossibility to receive or follow instructions from national governments and the commitment to serve uniquely the European common interest, commissioners themselves, I was saying, serve the vital purpose of bringing to the consideration, debate, and deliberations of the College of Commissioners the unique insight of local and national dynamics and perceptions that would otherwise not always be fully and instinctively, I would say, understood and retained at European level. Now, in recent years, profound divergences of perception of the relevance, urgency, and magnitude of the challenges posed to the Union clearly emerged during the financial crisis, for instance. And then, while facing the flows of migrants and refugees across the Middle East and the Mediterranean, the closest member state was to the problem, financially or geographically, the most acute was its sense of urgency, and consequently, its readiness to adopt drastic and unprecedented measures to address it, being it at the level of national institutions, governments and parliaments, or of public opinions, as one needs the other to advance and move from narrative to decisions and actions. Now, some argue that the same divergence of perception had emerged also during the crisis in Ukraine in 2014, first with the Russian aggression in the east of the country, and then with the illegal annexation of Crimea. In fact, I can witness that, on the contrary, those actions were clearly and immediately identified by the entire European Union, no member state excluded, as blatant violations of international law. And as such, they represented a threat posed to the entire international legal order and also the multilateral architecture, and more specifically to security and cooperation in the European continent. And that had to be addressed with a united and consistent reaction. The discussion among member states and across the international community on the appropriateness of measures to be taken to respond to the Russian actions in Ukraine was not centered on whether it was necessary or appropriate to react, nor on the urgency and gravity of the matter, and consequently on the extraordinary need for exceptional measures, but rather on what would have been, in practical terms, the most effective response the European Union and the entire global community could have adopted. So in that case, unity of purpose was not under any doubt or discussion, and the sense of urgency and gravity was equally spread across the continent, even if in some countries history and geography naturally connotated the narrative in a stronger way than in others. But the substance was commonly shared. And this has, in fact, allowed back then the European Union to take decisions unanimously and then keep a consistent course of action over time once a decision was taken on the measures to be adopted, and namely sanctions matched with a set of diplomatic efforts that led to some achievements, but unfortunately not to the solution of the crisis. Now, during the first months of 2020, instead, facing the initial spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, the dynamic in the continent seemed to duplicate the one that the European Union had experienced in relation to the migration flows, a completely different perception of the sense of gravity of the phenomenon across countries, leading to dramatically diverging analysis and proposals on measures and policies at institutional level. I personally remember very well following the news in different member states in late February 2020, and you could easily believe that they were reporting two completely different realities, far away in time and space. And yet, over a few weeks, just a few weeks, the entire European continent and the entire world realized that the pandemic was set to change the way lives were lived, economies and societies were organized, health systems were responding, and even global interactions were reshaped and reoriented. In the course of March 2020, everything, every single aspect of life changed everywhere, with dramatic losses of lives and a sense of profound vulnerability to which our societies were suddenly and completely unexpectedly exposed. The mourning, combined with the devastating psychological, social, and economic impact of the pandemic itself, and also the measure imposed by the need to contain it, brought the entire continent and far beyond into a collective state of mind it had never experienced before. Fear, loss, isolation, uncertainty on even very basic aspects of daily life. And most dramatically, probably, the other, the neighbor, the friend, the family member, perceived as a literally vital threat. And at the same time, the need to come together as a community to try to survive and recover in solidarity. During those months of spring 2020, Europe faced probably the most dramatic and acute collective crisis it had ever experienced since the end of World War II. The EU institutions at that date had just started their cycle. Plans and priorities were discussed, approved, set, working methods evaluated and defined, teams built, contacts established, interlocutors identified inside and outside the European Union. And these are all processes that require an immense amount of work, time, energy, focus, consensus, but most of all, constant and deep personal connections. the newly established European leadership started to exercise its functions in the most challenging environment ever experienced by any generation of European leaders ever. Not only they had to face and handle the complexity of challenges and crises we already mentioned above, from the pandemic itself to the Brexit negotiations, just to mention two, but they had to do it as a newly composed team without the time nor the possibility to elaborate and consolidate practices, formats, policies, and even channel of communications that would have been vital for effectiveness and efficiency of actions at all levels and in all fields, both internally and externally. Now, this tells us that the risk of disruption between March and April 2020 was concrete and high. Had the European Union failed to react properly, immediately, boldly, and in a united manner, this would have probably led us to the end of the integration process once and for all. The challenge was immense, the tools to respond to the crisis not in place, and the magnitude of the potential for disruption so dramatic that it was even difficult to describe it at the time. It took some time, precious time if you consider the speed of the contagion and the impressive number of deaths in those initial weeks. But the European Union reacted. And let me say, it reacted incredibly well, in unity and solidarity. It reacted mobilizing resources that were not predictably available, and even taking decisions and action on issues that were completely out of its institutional competences. And let me say that it could have been much easier for the EU institutions to simply ignore or decline the call for action that was dramatically rising from our communities and remain in the comfort zone clearly designed by the intersection of the well-defined institutional competences and the lack of instruments and tools at their disposal for an appropriate reaction. Instead, the EU leadership was wise and brave enough to accept the risk and navigate in the uncharted waters of building and shaping a common, coordinated, shared European response to the pandemic. Far from perfect and with some delay, yet the decisions and actions that the European Union chose to take in spring 2020 not only provided literally life-saving instruments at the disposal of member states and local communities, both in the health sector and in the one related to the economic recovery, but also showed that the institutions had full awareness of the relevance of the challenge. After 2 decades of multiple and faceted crises, in the midst of the most dramatic existential threat Europe had ever faced in almost a century, accepting the challenge of entering the unknown and unexplored territory of shaping policies and tools and finding relevant necessary resources needed to save Europe from the pandemic and its consequences, while all of this was not only a moral duty vis-à-vis its citizens, but it was also a matter of survival for the Union itself. It was somehow a declaration of self-confidence against all odds. And I would say the collective capacity to explore the institutional, political, and even financial potential of the Union outside of the beaten track. The EU decided to do something that was never done before, and that it was never foreseen to be done, something completely exceptional and unique for any institution, let alone the most complex of all. The European Union has launched major and unexpected initiatives, namely in 2 different domains in 2020, both extremely sensitive and potentially controversial. Health, on which the treaties assign extremely limited competencies to the European institutions, and the economic recovery, on which political controversies had proliferated during the previous years, making it fundamentally impossible to imagine that the measures that were actually adopted in 2020 would have been ever conceived. Now, looking at them one by one, on the health sector, the European Union responded to the pandemic by stretching and expanding its role and functions. It worked to ensure the availability of medical equipment and supplies, uniting efforts to overcome the limits of long supply chains that exposed Europe to a major risk of shortages. Under the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, the Union established a RESC-EU strategic medical stockpile of equipment and supplies. It used the joint procurement of medical equipment to sign more than 50 contracts following calls for tenders. It has strengthened the role of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control and of the European Medicines Agency. It has encouraged and supported concrete and immediate acts of solidarity among member states with cross-border delivery of medical equipment and reciprocal offers to take in patients in intensive care structures. The EU action has also been crucial to support member states to develop effective coronavirus vaccines and ensure access to them, and also to treatments and tests, with an unprecedented investment in support of a truly European pharmaceutical strategy. This extraordinary combination of novelties make it possible today to open a reflection on how to strengthen the European Union role in the health sector, using the Conference on the Future of Europe to launch a broad public debate on the perspectives and priorities of the European Health Union. But just a few years ago, before 2020, it would have been highly improbable to develop not only actions and to mobilize the respective necessary budgetary resources, but even to start and sustain a political debate about competencies on issues like those that are today the absolute priority of the European institutions, such as speed and safety of regulatory processes in the health sector, investments on research development on therapeutics, large-scale EU clinical trials, financing and procurement capacities, securing supply chains and delivery of equipment and therapeutics, facilitating international cooperation and distribution, and this just to mention a few. The first and clear impact of 2020, so on the future of our union, I would say is the unprecedented focus and investment on the European dimension of health policies and respective instruments, including research. Coming to the second field of action, in which extraordinary novelties have been introduced, that is the one of the European support to the economic recovery in member states. After the very harsh debates and fights, even around which measures would have been appropriate or needed to contain and overcome the Eurozone crisis of the previous years, it was clearly a very dangerous political minefield, and even more so for a European leadership that has just started its mandate. And yet, a recovery instrument of around 800 billion euros was established, with the purpose of not only supporting the economies of the continent, but also to incentivize the Green Deal and the digital agenda, blending in a very smart way the new urgency dictated by the pandemic with the political priorities set by the institutions at the very beginning of their mandate. But what was extraordinary in this decision was not only the magnitude of the instrument, the speed of the decision-making timeline, we always say the European Union is slow, not in this case, and the mix of immediate and long-term priorities. But what was extraordinary, I believe, was first and foremost the fact that for the very first time in the history of the European Union, the Commission would have borrowed significant amounts on behalf of the European Union on the capital markets, using its high credit rating to negotiate advantageous financial terms for loans and grants, and transferring these benefits to member states using the EU budget to back the borrowing. Now, no one would have ever imagined, even a few months before 2020, that this decision would have been taken. So let me say that in 2020, the pandemic killed a taboo. This unprecedented step is undoubtedly the most evident sign that the European Union managed to react to the COVID crisis in a way that not only responds to the immediate urgencies of the crisis itself, but also shapes the future of the integration process in a more structural manner. Jean Monnet's words must have turned into the European leaders' heads constantly during those crucial negotiations in spring 2020. L'Europe se fera dans les crises, et quelles crises, et elle sera la somme des solutions apportées à ces crises. One giant step was taken, a taboo was broken. Now, overcoming taboos is not only relevant in immediate practical terms, it doesn't only impact the field of action it is applied to, it also shows in itself the capacity, the will, and the determination of an institution, in this case, a complex set of complex institutions, to go beyond the natural instinct of conservative practices, processes, and policies. Because the most recurrent attitude in any institution and organization is the tendency to repeat practices and policies of the past. Any innovation is naturally and instinctively confronted with the basic, fundamental question: it has always been done this way, it has always worked, so why should we change? I believe this is one of the main sources of problems our institutions face at all levels, from local municipalities to the European and international ones. the almost unconscious resistance to transformation and adaptation, the tendency to homologate and absorb people and ideas into a flow of action that in substance represents a reassuring repetition of the past. Shades can change, but colors remain the same. It cannot be done because it has never been done. This represents a mantra that is probably also a survival tool, somehow a guarantee of continuity that is vital probably in institutions and organizations that experience a constant turnover of staff and leadership figures. But it often impedes capturing demands, needs, and trends that move fast in society, and long-term it contributes to that sense of disconnection between institutions and ordinary people. And this is what fuels so powerfully anti-system feelings in public opinions and in the political discourse. Resistance to change in the institutions can be a very dangerous element in the equation of what we currently refer to as populism. So breaking taboos in this framework represents a major contribution to re-establishing a connection and eventually a certain decent level of confidence between public opinions and institutions. Because together with the taboo, what is challenged and overcome is the assumption that change is fundamentally impossible. That messages coming from societies are not heard, not understood, and in any case not taken into serious consideration as a valid basis for political decision-making. So with the historic decision taking in spring 2020 to create the largest stimulus package ever, with unprecedented use of EU instruments in the hardest moment for citizens and communities so dramatically hit by the pandemic and its economic and social consequences, this has shown that the European institutions have a much higher level of awareness, courage, creativity, and understanding of reality than expected. This boost in credibility is probably the most relevant element of the way in which 2020 has shaped the future of Europe. Breaking such a heavy taboo signals that the increasing demands and expectations expressed by public opinions and political leaderships towards the European Union could turn from being a trap, the easy and comfortable search for a scapegoat, to actually becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If in times of existential threats, member states turn towards the European institutions to find and build together solutions, they could manage to get them. This introduces potentially two long-term innovative dynamics, I believe. On one side, the distance between capitals and Brussels could diminish. As solutions are actually found, mechanisms are established with a shared responsibility for proper implementation, the political discourse that used to fuel the anti-European feelings loses ground and arguments. Capitals asked Brussels, Brussels replied, and it is now for capitals to make it work. If the recovery plan will fail or succeed, the responsibility will be a shared one. And this reduces to zero the interest that some political leaders could be tempted to have of celebrating the failure of the European Union as a national success. Now national and European interest and responsibility finally totally coincide. This happens regularly, actually, on basically all policy choices, but the mainstream narrative doesn't often reflect this reality. Now, in 2020, the shift from a confrontational discourse to a cooperative one, based on shared responsibility and solidarity, started to be the norm rather than the exception. Not a minor achievement, especially after the trends of the previous 2 decades. On the other side, the breach of the taboo that the adoption of the recovery plan represented sets the already planned conference on the future of Europe on a completely different stage. Because if taboos can be broken, if the urgency of citizens' needs can be heard, then there is a chance that this exercise, the Conference on the Future of Europe, manages to go beyond a light and vague consultation mechanism on a broad scale, but actually gets to focus on some real innovations in terms of processes or policies. Everything is possible. This is what 2020 tells us. And the open-ended nature of the conference in this framework turns from being a limit to representing a potential asset, not to be given for granted, rather the opposite, but the possibility has opened up. And it is at least not to be excluded. It will be obviously in the hands of European, national, and local institutions, but also of civil society and international bodies and intermediate bodies to capture this opportunity and make the best out of it. 2020 has also introduced one important potential element of acceleration when it comes to the global role of the European Union. And let me conclude on this. First of all, it became evident more than ever that in times of crisis, what is really needed is a well-functioning, cooperative, multilateral institutional framework through which transparent information sharing and constructive solution building can be possible at global or regional scale. The pandemic showed, in fact, beyond the politicization of narratives and communications around the origins and the effectiveness of responses to COVID, that there is no possible effective solution to a global pandemic in the absence of a truly cooperative and coordinated response at an international level. 2020 made it undeniable that national interests coincided with global interests and vice versa. As long as we are not all free from the pandemic, we will all be hostage of it. No one can live the illusion of being safe if the others are not safe. Solidarity, for all those looking at the crisis with some degree of rationality, solidarity became the new name for self-interest. And now, being the European Union one of the key pillars and sponsors of a cooperative multilateral international order, its role as a catalyst became even more crucial than before, when this need was already quite self-evident. The way in which the European Union supported both the production and supply of medical treatments and vaccines at continental level, not to mention the regulatory role it played and continues to play, and the economic recovery of member states with the stimulus package, increased the perception of its relevance worldwide and, I believe, inspired others to follow similar patterns of action. Many around the world during 2020 turned towards the European Union for guidance, advice, and support, and many received it. Global power struggles went hand in hand with the search for international cooperation, this is needless to say, but the European Union voice as a strong promoter of a multilateral approach to the crisis has been clear and relevant in the world dynamics. And the second aspect on which 2020 influenced the global role of the European Union has to do with its external competencies. It is well known that consular activities remain in member states' hands, with extremely limited opportunities for the European Union to play a role in this field. But when the pandemic started, the massive work required to contact, inform, assist, and repatriate all EU nationals from every corner of the globe was largely supported and even in some cases directly done by the European Union, using the impressive network of EU delegations in the world and the economy of scale of a target population with continent-sized numbers. So another taboo was broken. Building on it will not be self-evident, but a precedent is set. It's not the first one for sure, most relevant one for numbers and impact. And this could contribute to shaping the future of Europe in a very practical manner, pushing maybe towards a systematic common European action in consular activities. If Europe will be built in times of crisis and through the responses that will be given to crisis, then we can undoubtedly say that 2020 represented a crucial year for shaping the future of our Union. In the key sectors of health and economy, and partially on the global role of the European Union, the crisis opened the way to potentially impressive opportunities. Doors were opened, paths designed, taboos broken. Now, whether these changes will turn into a consolidated trend or will represent a parenthesis, this will depend on the political will and capacity of the European leadership, institutions, societies. As always, the future of Europe will be shaped by Europeans, as the Union is and becomes what its citizens decide to make of it. But there is no doubt that after 2020, the potential for change is there if the will for it will also be there. The crisis has turned into an opportunity, and now it's for Europeans to build on it and design what the Union of the future will be. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rector Mogherini, for your very insightful lecture. I would like to remind the audience that they can put their questions into the chat on the right side of the screen. You can use the live stage chat for this. But before we turn to the audience, or while we wait for people to type their questions in, I'm going to use my position as chair, and I will ask the first question, if that's okay. So you've very clearly set out the wider context within which the 2020 crisis unfolded. And I think this is really welcome and important. And I was personally particularly interested in your insights that, unlike previous crises, 2020 might have reminded members of the centrality of the common interest for the project, mostly, and also mostly for their own self-interest. Your lecture, therefore, outlines the way in which the EU demonstrated confidence and leadership. And I think there will be many papers going forward in the next few years looking at this very role of leadership. And this has actually happened against a backdrop of what can be seen as the reassertion of sovereignty, particularly in the early day of the pandemic. So the question to you is, as we kind of reflect back 18 months into this and this crisis that potentially has changed the project, has this happened through the reassertion of what some might actually term as Fortress for Europe? So the reassertion of Europe, not against, but vis-a-vis the other and the rest of the world. And do you think this was inevitable, or is it something that the institutions will need to consider in more detail in order to capitalize on the gains of the last 18 months and assert the role of the EU as an international actor in the 21st century? Thank you.
Question. Thank you for this. That would require an additional lecture of a couple of hours, probably. And I have to say, I probably don't have a straightforward answer. I think it might be a bit too early to assess if this renewed sense of unity that we have seen developing in this last few months is at the expenses of the openness of the project, or if this is connected with the last element I mentioned, the previous last element I mentioned, which is the fact that the pandemic highlighted the fact that you cannot be saved if all the others are saved at the same time. I would say that the answer to your question, I would put it in the crossroad at the balance of these two elements, for sure. And probably the two trends are coexisting in European societies today. And this is a contradiction in terms that probably will stay with us for a while as we struggle to come out completely from the pandemic. Meaning, on one side, this sense of urgency and depth of the dramatic aspects of the impact of the crisis. This is life and death. And we Europeans have not handled life and death issues for the last many decades. This is why I'm saying this has been the first time in Europe we've got to a crisis at the same, comparable to the dramatic impact of the Second World War, because for the first time we were faced with issues that were killing us. And this has not happened, luckily, in the last 70 years. So on one side, this triggers a more than natural and human reaction of me and the loved one first. And so indeed, the sense of coming together as Europeans can be fueled and can translate into me first as a European. Vaccines here first, for instance, treatments here first. But on the other side, and this trend naturally exists, and this trend might turn into moving from nationalism to the Europe that protects only Europeans, what you call the fortress. But on the other side, I think you also have the awareness in European societies of a completely opposite trend. And this is until my neighbors, Europeans or non-Europeans, will be facing this threat, this risk of life and death, I will not be really safe, because it comes. Because there's no, this bottom line, this would be my answer probably, there is no fortress that can defend you from viruses or climate disruption. I mean, there are some things on which walls don't work. And they are multiplying rather than diminishing in our times. and I think that this understanding, this awareness is there in European societies, that actually you cannot really defend yourself if you also don't invest in solutions for the others. But these two trends, I believe, are currently coexisting in European societies, probably even in individuals, because again, when it's a matter of life and death, this can happen. Not always individuals and societies and communities and even institutions follow the logic. Acting rationally in situations of deep crisis and life and death issues is not always to be given for granted. We know it from history. So I think that it will take a little bit of time for Europe to, and also for other parts of the world, because the same trend is happening everywhere, to find the balance between prioritizing internal needs and investing on external cooperation and solidarity that is actually serving the self-interest also of internal needs. Was this inevitable? Probably yes, I have to say. Probably yes, because again, I think that no one would have imagined that we would have needed I would say even the psychological and conceptual toolbox to deal with what has happened. I think that obviously we have all focused and we've all reflected upon the health system resilience, the economic and financial instruments we could put in place. I think that very few have profoundly reflected on the fact that our societies at large were completely unprepared to face, from a psychological and societal point of view, the death threat. And I think that, this probably includes an element of unpredictability and inevitability of the fact that not everything was linear, not everything was rational. But again, I think that in the situation where this happened, the reaction of the European Union institutions, all of them together, including the local communities and the societies, has been quite remarkable. And I have to say, it could have been a make it or break it moment. And it became a make it, luckily for all of us, I think.
Great, thank you. Thank you
so much, Rector, for this fantastic and spot-on lecture or speech on the occasion of our annual review lecture. I'm transferring the question of our UASIS incoming president, Professor Simon Asherwood from the Open University, and I will read the question to you as Simon has kindly posted it on our chat box. Rector, thank you for a very stimulating talk. You focused on the advances of health and economic recovery, but how does this sit with the growing threat to rule of law and the challenge to fundamental values? Put differently, are outputs enough, or do we have to make sure work too? Thank you.
I mentioned this at the very beginning of my lecture. Among the multiple crises we had faced already in the previous 2 decades, and again, I apologize because I know that normally the focus is on 1 year, but I felt that 2020 was somehow the peak of a season of crises, and so I had to take a look backwards and see the sequencing of things. In the list, the long, unfortunately, long and sad list of the crises that we have experienced and we've lived in the previous 2 decades, I've mentioned in my lecture also the shrinking space for human rights and democracy and rule of law, including on European soil, as part of a global trend. I believe that this is an extremely worrying development in Europe. Again, I don't think this is, clearly this is not only a European dynamic. This is clearly a global trend that is affecting literally every part of our globe, on which I believe not enough political and even academic reflection is being paid, because it is now already a trend that is going on since quite a few years, and again, with clear global connections and repercussions. But in Europe, for us, it's particularly striking, obviously, because we have a set of rules and norms and institutions that are there to protect us from these deviations or derailing temptations that are, again, to me, sad and worrying. I don't think that the two things are necessarily connected. I think actually that at a certain moment in 2020, we have faced a very dangerous beginning of debate. I think that it was contained quite and directed well quite soon. But you might remember in the first months of the pandemic, also in Europe, the debate started about how efficient and effective democracies could be in front of a pandemic. You remember that kind of discussions about the fact that authoritarian regimes might have more instruments to impose measures, for instance, being them restrictive measures, being them decisions to move budgetary resources from one sector to another in one day, overnight, without any need for complicated checks and balances. And personally, I found that extremely dangerous and worrying because obviously, if it's one person deciding for millions or billions, it takes less time. But the good thing of democracy and even complex democracies as the European ones, and even more complex as the European Union institutions, the good point of this is that once you get to a decision, there is certain stability and representativity in it. I think that kind of debate finished quite soon in Europe, also because the institutions managed to give answers quite rapidly on reshuffling, for instance, or repositioning key elements of the budgetary support. Somehow, I think that this is also something I try to highlight in my lecture. I think that the fact that economic resources were mobilized in an unprecedented manner and with unprecedented instruments somehow also helped to stop at the very initial phase the debate about democracies not being able or not having instruments efficient enough to mobilize quickly the resources that were needed. So I think that if there has been a contribution to limiting and containing the tendency to diminish the space for democracy and rule of law, and instead augmenting the space for democracy and an open society, I think that the decisions that were taken in spring 2020 have helped containing those trends. Is output enough? No, because as a proud European and as someone that has represented the European Union abroad, I can tell you even a tiny element of discrepancy between our values as they are written and as they are practiced is too much. So I think we have really a lot to work on in these aspects still.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive answer. I hope Simon is satisfied with this response. I think it's a very interesting topic to touch upon. Now, I would like to sort of move away from this topic to maybe another very interesting element. There's a question from Vwiro Suogeni Hope Gola Ebue, who is asking, following the huge rate of deaths recorded in the EU as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, are there any measures to encourage regularizing migrants with irregular status in order to help build back the population loss generally? And let me add here also economic production. This is my own side comment.
Let me stress that I agree very much with your comment. It's clear that I've repeated this along the years, and in many cases I've been politically attacked for this, which is something that I have always accepted with a lot of calm and serenity. Europe needs migration. It's a simple matter of fact. And if you look at the research aspect of it, I mean, if you look at it from an academic point of view, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the reality of facts, Europe needs migration, both from a demographic point of view, because we have an aging population, and also from an economical point of view. imagine the costs of not having migration. Entire sectors of our society would collapse. Entire sectors of our economies would collapse. By the way, entire sectors of the health systems would collapse. And we know what it means now in all our countries, no one excluded. So I've always considered this as, not an act of goodwill, not something that Europe should do, or European governments or institutions should do out of good sentiments, good feelings, or even worse, out of a charity approach. No, it's self-interest. It's that we need migration in Europe to sustain our societies and our economies from a demographic point of view, but as you said, also in terms of production processes and yes, our economies. So absolutely yes. But also, I think that the pandemic has shown us in immediate terms and dramatic terms how dangerous it is to have non-regularized people on your territory. If you are invisible, the problem is not only for the invisible person. The problem is also, and the pandemic has shown that maybe for the first time ever, clearly, that the problem is also for the people around the invisible person. Healthcare, vaccination, medical treatment, but even screening and testing, you need to be somewhere on the papers to be part of that. And this is vital for you, but it's also vital for those living in your same community and environment. So I think that indeed there is an interest, a self-interest for all European countries to go in this direction from a point of view of demography, from a point of view of economy, but also, I would say, from a point of view of health safety.
Very much, Rector. Roberta. I think you're muted.
Yeah. I was just looking to see if there are any additional questions from the stage. I don't think there are any, though I see Simon is typing. I have lots of questions, but I don't really want to abuse my position as chair. But I certainly really enjoyed the discussion that you started about leadership. And certainly there is quite a lot currently taking place in relation to research on leadership as well. And there is also someone else typing. Fanis, do you have anything that you...
I actually have a more general question, and perhaps this is a good opportunity for the Rector to make some reflections on it. So considering 2020, what are the next challenges for the EU in 2021? Now we're closing 2021, but also beyond. Is this something that have taught us lessons to move European integration forward, for example? Is this year something that has given us new perspectives on issues that have tantalized Europe for a long time? Is it sustainable as a momentum for European integration? Thank you.
Well, I guess this is the topic of next year lecture, but as I would probably not be doing it, I'm happy to share my thoughts on this. Now, I think that there are some fundamental key lessons that will remain, will stay. And so that the momentum on some issues will be kept and maintained. Some very relevant, but also basic ones. I give you an example. I believe that it would be impossible to go back to arguing that investment in public health systems is not appropriate to have. I think that debate is beyond, is in the past. I don't see any coming back in the future of debates about, for instance, cutting resources to the public health system and also to research. This is an aspect that has probably not yet been completely unveiled, but I think that one of the big consequences of what we've lived in 2020 and that will remain, I hope it will remain also as a rector, is the fact that Europe will invest more and more on research. Because we have understood, I think, at least we have seen, I hope we have understood, that strategic autonomy doesn't depend only on defense issues. It depends on research, on human capital, on knowledge, on supply chains, on the capacity to produce medicaments, for instance, and vaccine. And the investment in research is the basis sometimes for your political strategic autonomy, if we want to use a buzzword today. So I hope that that this two main assumptions, investment on the health sector and investment on research, will be some basic elements on which there will be no way backwards. Then I highlighted the element of breaking a taboo on how to use the EU budget as a guarantee to borrow money. I understand that the vision I've presented is a very Italian one, probably, and probably if you had a different nationality for the keynote speaker, you would have had probably a completely different vision. But I have the impression that on this, the door is open, political discussion will follow, and a lot will depend on implementation of the stimulus package. I think that on this, time will tell if this is a sustainable, productive way to go, also in the future for other things, or if this is a one-off. I don't think this is a set match. I think this is still in the making. And in institutional terms, I don't see major changes coming up. This is my personal opinion. I think that, for instance, the Conference on the Future of Europe could come up with some innovative and out-of-the-box ideas on some processes or policies. Personally, I don't see treaty changes coming up in the future. But this is my personal approach. It's not only my personal approach, but the jury is still out. But I think that we will have some elements that will stay, and also obviously as an element that will stay with us, I think clearly is something that was already before indicated as a priority for the future. So in this case, I would say that the pandemic has confirmed the relevance of the political priorities that were set before, meaning digital and green agendas are there to stay for sure, even more after the pandemic than they were before, because we have seen what nature can turn into. And we clearly know that this is not only one isolated episode, but this is part of a disruption of our relation with nature, of our planet, and that it's serious and it can affect us seriously. And on the digital agenda, we have clearly seen that we cannot live without. We cannot live without. So both priorities that were set at the beginning of the institutional cycle of the European Union, I think, get out of the pandemic year strengthened even more than they were before. But they were there before.
Thank you very much. Roberta, would you like to take the next question?
Thank you. So we have two questions. One is from Anna Molnar, and the other one is from Simon Asherwood, who wants to jump in with the second question. And I'm going to merge them together because I think they are interrelated. So Anna asks your opinion about the likelihood that majority voting will be introduced in CFSP. But also that relates to Simon's question, which is what role will fighting climate change play in the development of European external relations in the next years, especially considering some of your concluding comments that the threats facing the European Union and its members don't see borders and don't see boundaries.
Yeah. I think I'll start from the second one. I think because it's indeed a logical continuation of what I was saying before. I think that, well, already before the pandemic, the climate change angle in the foreign policy of the European Union and the EU external action was playing a major role. since quite some years. I would say that one of the things we were proud of as European leadership during my mandate was the contribution we gave to the Paris Climate Change Agreement that would have been indeed impossible without the European Union, and also on the implementation phase. So, and this has been one of the elements that has been streamlined across all different sectors of external action of the European Union. So for sure this is going to grow, and for sure this is going to bring some sort of changes in the way in which the institutions work among themselves and within themselves. I'll give you an example that is very basic, but is very pertinent to what the question refers to. Once upon a time, there was the RELEX commissioners, the family of commissioners that were related to external action. Nowadays, how would you define the external competences only limited to some portfolios of some commissioners? How would you argue that climate change is also not an external action? So this would push, from an institutional point of view, I think this would push institutions to rethink on how they increase and make it more effective the working together of different DGs in the Commission, for instance, or the External Action Service together with the Commission or together with the Parliament or the Council in different formations. So I think that this will lead to a more developed and a more articulated cross-sectoral policy making in the institutions that were before used to go by silo. So you do foreign policy, and it means you do diplomacy, mediation, conflict-related issues, and then you do trade, and then you do humanitarian assistance, and then you do, I don't know, digital, and then you do transport, and then you do health, and each of them were separate. Now it's clear there's not one single competence of the European Union that doesn't have an external action element to it, and there's clearly an intersection between climate change action and external action, and this is going to develop more and more in the years to come. No doubt on this, and this would require. I don't know how detailed you want me to go on this and how interested the audience is in this, but this would require, for instance, a change in the training of the officials. And this is something we do a lot in the college, for instance, and you do probably a lot in different institutions, academic institutions that are connected this evening. How you adapt the way in which you train the future officials to the new skills and new developments and new policies and new cross-cutting policies that you need to put in place. But also this would require a different kind of profiles, for instance, in the European Union delegations around the world, where before normally you had the development people, you have the political people, you had the trade people. Now you would need to have more and more the climate change people. And this is not necessarily something that, well, it's there already in some places, but this would require a massive investment, I think, in changing the way institutions work. On qualified majority voting, I'll tell you my opinion. The question is how likely it is. If I am, is it possible? Is it likely to happen? I would not bet on it. Definitely not. I don't see this coming. And I would add, which is a very unusual opinion to express in these times, and let me be unconventional. I think that we don't necessarily need a majority voting in CFSP. Personally, I think this would even be a negative development for the European Union foreign policy and security policy. Why? I can tell you something about this in brief. It's my personal experience, it's my personal opinion. First of all, because this would take away from the High Representative a very powerful tool to achieve consensus. In negotiating tactics, you achieve consensus if you have good arguments to push your interlocutors to give up to something in order to have a common position. If your interlocutor can tell you, but you can go ahead without me, you would not have any single decision taken unanimously at the end of the day, because everybody would find it more comfortable to step out, and this would not block the others. And this might lead at a certain moment to to a disintegration of the consensus building in the European institutions. While in so many cases, you have a very strong argument, you have a very strong tool in your hands to say, you cannot really afford blocking an entire decision because of this. Can we find a way forward together? And I can tell you personally, in my 5 years, I know maybe it was exceptional, but we had quite some crises. In the 5 years, we never had a consensus issue in the Council. What we had was a lack of implementation will of the decisions. But this is not something that you solve with the qualified majority voting. On the contrary, a member state could even feel less obliged to implement a decision if it was not part of it. You decided, you implemented, I'm out. And in foreign policy and in security policy, it's not a legislative action. It's not, I mean, the implementation has to do with a lot of times with statements and actions and reaching out and initiatives that you cannot measure from a legislative point of view. So allowing member states not to be on board of the common decision is actually weakening your position as European Union. It's actually weakening the possibility that you have to reach consensus, which is possible because we reach consensus on everything basically. But again, the real thing to work on is not the decision-making process formally. I think it's the sense of ownership for the implementation of the decisions. And also, last but not least, with the qualified majority voting, you certify the divisions. And this weakens you in foreign security policy vis-a-vis your interlocutor external. I would not mention any country, but the foreign minister of X countries can then go to the High Representative or to the President of the European Council and say, you're divided on this. And then you cannot say, no, we are not, because it's certified, it's on paper. You are divided on something. And in foreign security policy, you should never, never certify your internal divisions because this gives you much less instruments to interact with the outside world. So I think it's unlikely to happen. And I would say it's good if it doesn't happen from my personal point of view.
Thank you very much, Rector. I think this is an important message that you are sending out, and I think our audience is also picking up on your experience and your contribution from your leadership point of view within the European Union. So there are two questions that are, again, on the international aspect of the European Union and the global and the position of the EU in the world. The first one is by Sabrina Liu, and she says, you mentioned how it is a momentum in itself that the Commission managed to use some, would even say seize this opportunity to extend its power in areas where it has no legal competence. How will this development have an impact on the EU's global actorness? That is, in international organizations such as the UN or the WHO, where member states still prefer to speak on their own. How does this impact EU affairs? And then there is a kind of a related question by Simon Sweeney, which kind of reflects on your point here on someone external to the EU coming in and saying expressing different positions, other than stern rhetoric, which we can discuss, of course, as a comment. What can the EU do in respect of misbehaviors and misses in brackets by other powers, Russia, China, Brazil, when individual member state interests may prefer to maintain close economic ties? So that is a follow-up to exactly what you were reflecting on.
Yeah, I start with the first question. First of all, let me make a distinction that is fundamental for me, having been in the role of Vice President of the Commission, but also President of the Council on Foreign Affairs, meaning High Representative. I refer to an extension of the competences of the European institutions beyond their legal competences, not necessarily of the Commission. I say this because, for instance, when I refer to the fact that the European Union expanded and extended its competences at the beginning of the COVID crisis on consular issues, that was not the Commission doing it. It was the External Action Service. on the health sector, indeed, it has been more the Commission extending its competences, but always backed by the Council. I think it's extremely important to have this preliminary observation before I answer the question, because I think that especially if the European institutions go in the direction of testing the limits or even stretching the limits and the boundaries of its competences, first of all, there's a legal issue to consider. Secondly, there's a political opportunity, but I would say, it's even more important than in normal times that this doesn't happen coming from one EU institution against the other. To say it more clearly, I think that if the EU institutions test the limits and try to expand and extend their competences to respond to crisis, for instance, as they've done, it's extremely important that they do it in the full respect of the internal boundaries of competences within the different sectors, so that the Council doesn't stretch over and reaches out the competences of the Commission and vice versa. Why? Because such an exercise that is not treaty-based works only on the basis of a political agreement within the institutions and within the member states. So I think that, again, this is why it's important to stress it was not, in my opinion, it was not necessarily the Commission stretching its competences, it was the entire body of the EU institutions, including the Council and the External Action Service. That is not an institution, it's a service, but anyway, this would lead us to another kind of discussion. But it's important that this happens with all the institutions moving together and not jumping on each other's feet, because then it becomes an institutional fight, and for sure, at that moment, everything stops and goes back to the treaty as they are literally written, because then you know that every institution has its own legal service, and you would never get the same interpretation from two different legal services of the two different institutions. So this was a preamble. Is there a possibility that this creates some new dynamics or changes the role of the European Union in international organizations? I have to tell you, I think that this has started already before the pandemic. Not all the time, not every time, not all the issues. Indeed, as Simon asks, on human rights related issues, this has not always happened, far from that. So I would say, if you look at the international organizations, Geneva is probably more problematic than New York, let's put it this way, or Rome, on food and on food. Normally we don't have many issues, but also there, because, well, we can look at, let me forget Rome. But on human rights issues, sometimes member states indeed act each on their own as member states, asking the European Union to play the part of the common ground, asking, namely, this was a big source of frustration for me, asking basically to have the European Union covering the human rights angle, sometimes on behalf of all the at my time 28 member states, and then being free themselves bilaterally to do business. What I have experienced is normally that member states are able enough and interlocutors are smart enough to understand that they can do both things at the same time. So let the European Union do the bad cop and do business at the same time without blocking the European Union playing its part on human rights. This represents a problem. But in the international organizations, and in particular in the UN, and in particular even in the UN Security Council, cooperation and coordination of messages and actions among member states is now a practice since, I would say, at least 5 years, 6 years. And probably COVID is going to strengthen this. Yes, indeed. Absolutely.
For what was a very comprehensive answer, and also building on your own experiences and history within the European Union itself. And you mentioned at your time the EU 28, but now we are EU 27. So the following question by Anne-Laure Donskoy is, quite relevant. Having witnessed the Brexit negotiations regarding EU citizens' rights firsthand, the EU showed some tentative cross-DG work, but there was clearly protected territories which the negotiations suffered from. So Anne-Laure is pleased to hear your optimism that this will be the way forward after COVID, but how confident are you that there is real political and cultural will to stop silo working and see these kind of things materializing in practice?
Well, for me, this was again. I can elaborate on my direct personal experience on this because probably the High Representative, Vice President of the Commission, is the one that has more of an interest in bringing different services and DGs together in a coherent manner, because otherwise you enter into a contradiction in terms or even a conflict of interest with yourself when you have a proposal of the Commission to which you contributed to be approved by a council that you're chairing. If you don't find a way to square the circle there, you contradict yourself. But in my personal experience, the attitude, the natural attitude of the machine is indeed to work in silo. As I have to say, because I've experienced also national institutions, as the attitude of ministries is to act in silo. It's very difficult to find in any national government a natural predisposition of a Ministry of Interior to work with a Ministry of Defense. There must be a political push. And I took two ministries just to make an example. You can take health and foreign policy, whatever. But normally, even in a government, in a national government, you have a silo approach in the different ministries, not only within, but also among. Every DG is a ministry. The size, the impact, the complexity of the system is such that there is a sense of belonging, there is a sense of ownership of your own resources, decisions, human resources, decision-making procedures, even of your own council formation. So there is a certain tendency, a natural tendency to protect your space and do your things. And as I said in my lecture, also to try and protect the continuity of things, let's put it this way. I've always done like that, I continue to do like this. What I have seen during my 5 years is that when there is a strong political push from the top, it works. Otherwise, it doesn't work because it's too heavy to lift from the bottom. But I think that at least what I have seen, the quality, the human quality of the machine, of the structures, of the DGs, of the institutions. We talk about the DGs in the Commission, but we can talk of the Council, of the Parliament, of other institutions. The quality of the people working there is such that when they get a clear input from the political level that this is the way to go, the machine can turn immediately to full cooperation. I have experienced an incredible level of cooperation and coordination. For instance, when we did the work on the European defense, we were putting together different DGs, the External Action Service, the European Defense Agency, and the Military Committee. I mean, impossible to conceive. And it worked. But you need to get the clear input from the political level. And here it's very important, I think, that the political level has awareness of the fact that they are in charge, that it's a powerful machine, that the Commission or the institutions have a powerful body of officials, but at the end of the day, it's you having the political responsibility to give instructions and sense of direction. Then you also have to listen to advice, because it's qualified people that can advise you on many different things in a very wise manner. But it's extremely important that this sense of political guidance on priorities and ways in which you expect them to work is there. Because in the absence of there, it's only following the pipeline. And this sometimes creates discrepancies. But I'm very confident that the silo approach can be overcome as long as there is a political wish, a will, and determination to push for it. It's the only condition I see. And also that very relevant because sometimes we consider the structural elements, but we don't consider the human elements sometimes. In my experience, what has been key is to show that the political level, the commissioners or the president and or the presidents or the vice presidents work hand in hand together. If the structure sees that at the political level cooperation is happening, then they are incentivized to duplicate that level of cooperation at their level. So many times came to my desk a problem of conflict between or among different offices, and the only way to solve it was to give a joint instruction with another commissioner, with another vice president, saying, this is it. If we agree, you can agree. And not even, if we agree, you have to agree, which is a further step. And the same goes also among institutions, Commission, Council, Parliament. But I'm very confident and very positive about that, because again, as I said, as long as the political input is given, the quality of the officials in all institutions is such that it can be done like this.
Much, Rector Mogherini. We are bringing this session to a close, and I think you've given enough food for thought to all scholars and participants of this conference. But if I may ask a slightly more cliche question, considering your position and your prior experience and the content of this lecture, the historian of the future, looking back at 2020, what headline would she or he put on 2020 for Europe?
I'm tempted to respond to this question, to answer to this question in the way an academic would answer to you, which I'm not. And that is that 1 year backwards is definitely not something that would allow an historian to give any headline. Sorry, this is not a diplomatic answer, but history requires at least, I would say, at least a decade to be fully considered. So I think it's far too early to say. But yeah, if as a non-historian, if I had to give a headline, a title to 2020, is probably a sentence that can be interpreted in two opposite ways, which could give space for the future historians to interpret it, that everything is possible, or that nothing is impossible. Mm-hmm. And this can refer to negative and positive things.
Thank you so much, Rector Mogherini. And we are now coming to the end of our lecture and our question and answer session. And I think I can speak on behalf of a lot of people who are here today. Your call for greater funding for academic research is certainly music to all of our ears. I also would like to echo the messages in the chat. And thank you, Rector Mogherini, for the excellent lecture, your insights and comprehensive answers. I think it's clear from the questions and the comments that they were greatly appreciated. I guess our audience can look forward to see the lecture published in the annual review later this year. And for now, I would like to wish you all a really wonderful evening. And I hope you get to enjoy the last of the summer sunshine, which certainly is shining here in the southeast of England. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.